What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Behind the Door. Here with Jeremy Hiltz, here with a crew of amazing people helping us record and put our message out there. And just want to start off this episode by a big thank you to everybody who's been listening and tuning in and supporting the movement.
Speaking of that, Brendan, I just also want to ask everybody to subscribe to our podcast on any platform that you are obtaining it on. Just hit the subscribe, and you'll get that every time.
Download, subscribe, support. It's tantamount to getting the message out here, out into the communities, and we just appreciate all the support. And today we're going to talk about something that's super, super important. Unfortunately, it's not something that's talked about enough, but it's a fundamental part of the process of experiencing prison, incarceration, addiction, and everything that's adjacent to those communities. And today we're going to talk about loss. And, we're probably going to unpack this in a few episodes. We have some guests that we want to bring on to really, get into the specifics of what people lose. And today we're going to, kind of address some of it. But I can tell you that for me, from my personal experience, I lost a lot when I went to prison, even as a young man. And I think all the obvious things that people think about, you lose your freedom, you lose your autonomy, you lose all these, these things that kind of make you a person and establish your identity. But we don't talk a lot about, enough about the actual loss that you witness when you're in prison in terms of your friends and your family and people passing away. And for me personally, where loss really came into my focus was when I came home. And I realized how many of my brothers and my sisters that I had established connections with on the inside, and how many people in the community out here that I've really connected to, I've just watched people die, and sometimes it's from addiction, and sometimes it's from suicide, and sometimes it's from the stress and disease and sickness that comes from living multiple years and decades of the trauma of incarceration. And it's been something that's been really hard for me to wrap my mind around. And I know Jeremy and I have talked a lot about this over the years and bonded a lot about this because we've lost some really close friends, man, to this addiction, to this disease, to this, unfortunate poison that is the system that we talk about on this podcast, man. And, I just want to ask you, how has it been something that's evolved over the last 14 years for you that you've been, really deeply embedded into the community, reconciling with the constant loss that we have to experience, that we have to suffer through in this life that we're living?
I think when I've seen it so much, right? Like I even before I started doing a treatment center, like I just be talking, like just my friends and people that I were incarcerated with and things like that. It's just like it becomes part of. It's like, when's it going to happen next? You know what I mean? It's like not necessarily if or when, but it like happens so often, I think, for our sort of demographic of people that, what's interesting is that the loss almost becomes like, you commit a crime, you felt guilty of a crime, or you find yourself incarcerated for whatever the situation is, and the loss that comes with that almost becomes like double jeopardy, because it's like there's one thing to lose your freedom, and then you start like, my biggest fear when I was incarcerated was that my parents were going to pass away and all that stuff, and then when that stuff starts to actually happen, you actually start experiencing the loss. It's something that's very, very difficult to cope with. You know what I mean? And the things some of the stuff that makes me the saddest is when I see people that have done a significant amount of time, they get out of prison and then they pass away, and they haven't had a chance to even start living their lives yet for whatever reason. That's the thing, and it's like, why did this person, you get sentenced to 10 years, right? And you live 70 years, right? That's like, in relation to that, it's but like when you do 20 years and you die right after you get out, it's like that's a whole section of your life that you never get to see, you never get to live, you never get to rebound from. So sometimes when people are sentenced to long sentences, right, it turns into, it adds to the urgency of life and freedom, right? Like when somebody's, I think it was, I can't remember who it was, but he died. I think it was like 3 weeks after he got out from doing about 35 years.
Yeah, it was my friend Anthony.
Yeah, Anthony Norman.
Yeah.
Right? And that's like, that type of loss is like, because we become close to these guys, and then all of a sudden, you want to see you develop these relationships, and then you know how much they have to contribute to society, and they never get an opportunity to do that because they have to be punished. You know what I mean? It's like, it doesn't, that piece of it just does not make any sense to me.
Yeah, and when I think about loss, it's timely that you brought up my good friend Anthony specifically, because anytime that I think about loss out here, he's really the first person that comes to my mind. And I think about loss like from a bigger perspective. I think about what the community loses.
Yeah.
I think about what the individuals, the amount of loss that they suffer when you go into prison, and like what it is what it is. It's part of society where we've decided that punishment is the way for justice, and that punishment is the way to correct people. But like what I think people in the world don't understand is, sometimes punishment is such a simplistic answer that you don't even realize what you're taking from the community when you do that. And so with this specific story that Jeremy referenced, this man Anthony was one of the purest hearted people I've ever met in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I first started my sentence, for my first couple of years, like we weren't close, but I would always see the way he would move in the prison. I would see how he always treated people with respect, right? He was always kind. He was always, like genuine. I don't remember ever during the whole time that I was in prison looking at this individual and going, man, like he's scary or mean or disrespect. Like I never saw it with staff. I saw him be firm sometimes. Like I saw him advocate for himself and say like, no, you got to show me respect because that's what I show you. And I got really, really close to him when I was at the minimum facility where I was released from. And, I'm going to take up a little bit of airtime to tell this story because I hope that people understand that. I'm just going to reiterate, this person was the kindest, most purest person I've ever met. Not that I met in prison. His kindness and his purity has never been matched out here. I've never met somebody in the real world outside of the prison in the last 2 years who could, even like light a flame to his kindness. And he got out about 30 days before me. And we were working together at the Maine State Prison showroom in Thomaston, Maine, where we were selling all the goods that were made by the people who are in prison. And I remember we were sitting in like the break room at the job one day. And I asked him, Tony, you're about to go home from after like 30 something years. This is all you know. What's the first thing that you're going to do? I was like so interested because for me, getting ready to come home after 13 years and then thinking about this person that did almost 3 times the amount of time that I did, I couldn't even imagine how scary that must have been. And he said, Brandon, the only thing that I want to do is I want to spend time with my wife and I want to go to the White Mountains. And when he said that, my heart smiled because where I came home to is like 10 minutes from the White Mountains where I was living my first year. And I said, Tony, what's your plan for that? And he told me, we're going to take a drive. We're going to rent a hotel. We're going to do all this. And he started explaining to me how he was like, he turned into a child. This man was like, 50, late 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And he turned into a child talking about being in nature in the mountains. And I said, man, if you want to, don't waste your money on a hotel. Like, you stay at my camp. It's where I'll be moving. And for me, it was like so special to have that bond with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll never forget, he got out and a week later, he sent me pictures of him and his wife at my camp. And I got those pictures, man, and I was like, I cried. It made me so happy to see how excited he was, how at peace he was after 30-something years of being in prison. And in the letter he wrote me, he just talked about how grateful he was, how much gratitude he had to just not have anybody dictating his daily life anymore and to be out with his wife and like experience that love that literally you are stripped. It's completely stripped of you. You can't experience love at the level that you need to as a human while you're incarcerated. You can experience glimpses of it and pieces of it, but he wrote about just how happy he was. And I remember feeling I felt free in that moment, right? And then a week later, I got news that he was in a coma in the hospital with COVID. And this was at the time, you know, that's a whole other episode talking about COVID and how scary that was when you're in prison and you start learning about the science of it and the doubt and everything. And this was a time when people were doubting like the realness of COVID. And here's one of my best friends, one of the sweetest men I've ever known in my life, who did 30-something years in prison and fighting for his life less than 3 weeks after he got home after a 30-something year incarceration. And when Tony passed away, I was home. I went to my camp. I felt his spirit there. He left things for me, like these gestures of kindness that epitomize who he was as a human being. And when he passed away, number one, they wouldn't give me permission to go to the hospital and see him while I was on supervised community confinement. I was devastated by that. I was really resentful about that. And he passed away a couple days after I had asked if I could go see him. And that really framed for me, man, that like, not only did he not have the chance to live and do exactly what you're talking about, but like the world lost a person that the majority of the world is not even aware of because he was locked away for 30-something years. And people in our community didn't get to experience his light. And people in our community didn't get to experience his wisdom and his authenticity. And when he passed away, the first thing I thought about was his wife and his family. And then over time, as I was dealing with my grief at that loss, I really started thinking about the fact that like our system robbed the world of one of the most beautiful human beings I've ever met in my life. And I don't think people really understand that. Like the potential that you take from somebody when you send them away, you know, and we have all these assumptions and these narratives and stereotypes about who people in prison are. And Tony defied every single one of them. And he should have touched thousands, if not millions of people with his heart and his kindness. But he spent 30-something years in prison and then 30-something days max in the world before he passed away. And that's one that I'll never really come to terms with. You know what I mean? To think about that I didn't even get to see my friend and have one free day with him. And that loss for me really put into perspective just what the system takes from us as individuals, but also what the system takes from our community by instilling the belief that we're all bad people and we don't deserve to be in society. And at the end of the day, society deserved to have Tony, you know, and that was a loss that was really, really hard for me, man. It's one that I don't think I'll ever shake off. And still to this day at my can are some items that he left there that he made, you know, years ago and that our friends made at the wood shop that he left there. So I would have a piece of him and a piece of us in that place that's really peaceful and that's like a sanctuary to me. But we have stories, we have hundreds of these stories and they're never told, you know?
Yeah. You know, as I'm listening to you speak about your dear friend, right? And when I've been working with some of these guys that come out of the incarceration and you know, the potential that we see in people that they cannot see in themselves is really the loss that it's really what starts people down with like the real loss, right? Because I'm looking at somebody and going, man, this guy is like intelligent, he's smart, he's funny, and he's doing, but he looks at himself as something completely different, right? So the loss started to happen for him long before that moment that I'm sitting there talking to him, right? It happened to him way longer than that, right? And so when, you know, for whatever happens, they you know, sometimes they you know, people make decisions, they go off and do whatever, and then they die. You see, and then that's what we start grieving is that the potential that they had to be a leader in the community, that they had the potential of what they can give to the world, you know, and you really talked about that beautifully, and some of the, you know, there's that tragic piece of that, you know, somebody passes away of COVID, right? It's like this out of the blue tragedy, you know what I mean? And then you have other people that are in situations that are pretty predictable, you know what I mean? Like this guy's on this way, and then you go, there's just not enough resources, right? Mm-hmm. There's like there wasn't enough. The system wasn't designed to help a person the way they were really meant to be helped, right? Or they should be helped, right? And they get out with and they're left to deal with all this. And substances are taking people out all the time. I remember there was a guy that I knew really well, and he was he was supposed to come to our program from the county jail, and he couldn't for whatever reason. He was coming to our program, and they released him on a Saturday morning from the county jail. We didn't have a chance to get to him, right? He was supposed, and then I talked to him on the phone, and he's supposed to come into the program on Monday, and he dies from Saturday to Monday.
There, yeah.
And it was literally all they had to do was hold on to him until the weekend, or let him out. Like they let him out of the jail at 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, or communicate with you or other people in the community.
Yeah, somebody's got to be there to get him. You know what I mean? Like somebody's got to. And so he was on the streets of Portland, and then he passes away before he actually makes it to the house.
Yeah,
and that's there's a lot of stories just like that. A lot of the things that we see are completely preventable. You know what I mean? A lot of the things that happen in the community are sometimes, I wish that the whole community saw these men and women the way they deserve to be seen. You know what I mean? So when we do that, then we can reduce the loss because we provide people with the resources that they need. You shouldn't be getting out of prison fighting to find out where you're going to live at, or you have to live in a rooming house. So you got to, you know what I mean? Like there's got to be ways, if our correctional system invested money and time into people, right? You shouldn't get out with nothing. You know what I mean? There should be, you know what I mean? And so when people are getting out, this is where we start experiencing so much loss, And
it's interesting because like society has become desensitized to that loss through the narrative of like,
these are bad people. They're bad. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter the sacrifice you have to make, right? You just have to pay the price. You know what I'm saying? You have to atone for your sins, right?
Yeah.
And so when we take that attitude, everybody loses.
Everybody loses.
I was like, and you think about not only necessarily the death, but like the loss that like our children feel, right? When people are removed from the home, you think about the loss that our mom and dad, like those are completely different stories, right? Because I go away, you know what I'm saying, and I can remember writing, my daughter letters with my free stamp. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the only way I can communicate with her. You know what I mean? She's just like waiting for a free stamp from dad, and that, like the loss of like that
connection and relationship
with her father. You know what I mean?
And it's like what you just said is so true. Is like when you normalize dehumanizing people, right? When you normalize this idea of punishment to the point that we don't even care when you pass away, when you get out of prison, because we put that responsibility on you, right? So somebody comes home and doesn't have a place to stay and doesn't have food on their plate and doesn't have connection and community and resorts to substances in the middle of an opiate epidemic that started raging while they were in prison. They don't know the drugs on the street. They don't have like all this idea of personal responsibility and personal choice doesn't make any sense. But we've dehumanized people in prison and people in addiction to the point where society doesn't even necessarily consider it as a loss collectively. They just leave us who knew those people at their heart and their potential to grieve that loss. And they do that. And it's like the most vicious cycle, right? That we know at large society doesn't care about us when we die because we get reduced to the one thing or the series of things that we did wrong in our life. And it's this crazy thing that I've experienced, and I know you've experienced because we've all experienced it that live this life, is we also become desensitized to loss. But not for the same reasons. We become desensitized to loss because we experience so much of it and we recognize how fragile life is when you've lived this life of addiction and incarceration, that every day I wake up, every single day I wake up, and I wonder who the next person's going to be. And I watch people struggle, and I watch people not have their needs met. And then what you just said is the piece that is conveniently left out in the societal conversation. And it really is something that I've experienced anger, I've experienced grief, I've experienced depression over, is when somebody dies because of their addiction, when somebody dies because of their incarceration, when somebody dies because they didn't have their basic needs met because the system set them up for failure, and we put all the responsibility on them and we don't talk about the system, we also completely discount the experience of their humanity because they did have kids. And they did have mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and friends. And it's the part that I think this episode is so necessary to really start asking our listeners and people who are tuning into the reels and everything that we're doing to really ask yourself, what happens when somebody dies? You know, like when we've thrown somebody away, because that's really what's happening. We're throwing people away, right? From our prisons and from our streets who are experiencing substance use. And we've talked about trauma on this podcast, and we've talked about things that people don't choose. People don't choose their damaging childhood. People don't choose the experiences they go through when they're in prison. All those things affect you. You come home, and then you get lost in the system's failures, and then you pass away, and we don't talk about them as a full human, and that's what we have to start doing, right? I've lost people who were the most important parts of my community. I've lost people who were giants. If they had ever been given the opportunity and afforded the opportunity to make a change in this world and to fix how they felt about themselves because the stories that were told about them, they could have left a mark on this world that we could never measure, right? They could have saved other people, but the system failed them and they didn't get to. And we don't have that conversation enough.
Well, this is part of why I say this a lot, and it's like no one's coming to save us.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that because you know what I mean? Collectively, is society coming to say the only people that are going to be there? You know what I'm saying? And that may not necessarily be true. The only people, but like, who is really coming to save people that are getting out of prison?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's like the people that are really doing that and really can have an impact on reducing losses. People that have lived experience to create community, right?
Yeah.
Because we know how difficult it is to deal with that loss, right? But when I can deal with that loss with you, right? We've had mutual friends that have passed away recently, right? And what got me through it was being able to be with other people that have been through it and like understood that loss, and understood not only the loss of this person, but the loss of the potential.
The potential, right? Yeah.
That's in the, or like the loss of what they can add to not only our lives, but like the movement, right?
Yeah.
And when we look at it, like, you know, the thing that I've seen the most when you're talking about people that have passing away, coming out of incarceration, is what you've been talking about. Is like when we just ignore, not necessarily ignore, but like we look at people and we go, they're going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
They're fine. And they don't have the belief in themselves that they are going to be fine. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so that, and then we start returning to these defense mechanisms, and like, I'm going to, you know what I mean? And then it puts people's lives at risk.
When the whole world has told you that you're a failure over and over again,
that's where the loss has already started to happen.
That's where it begins, right? And so when the whole world has said you're not good, right? You failed, and this is your fault, and it completely fails to recognize the systems that you've come up against in your life that you didn't have a choice but to be victim to. That's where the loss begins, is when you're just told over and over again that you're a failure, and then you live a life and you watch while you're in prison society categorize everybody like you as failures, and then even when you realize your potential and you learn to be part of the community in prison, you learn to thrive, and you start working on yourself, and you start unpacking the things you've been through, and you get your education, you do all the things that the system boasts and brags about offering to you. You do all of that, and then you come home And you want to be that most positive version of yourself that you found inside of the prison. But then you encounter that failure narrative again. And that's what we've seen time and time again with our brothers and sisters, is coming home and wanting so badly to believe that, no, I'm not a failure. Like, I am somebody who has value, but then not be able to get a job, not be able to get housing, not be able to get treatment, and then slip, right? And let the depression and the anxiety get to them. And then see the faces of people that were like, oh, you had so much potential, what are you doing? And then internalize that, and then come back and then go in and out of the cycle, to the point that as much as every one of us who sees their potential believes in them, the hardest task is to get them to believe in themselves. And then we suffer that ultimate loss when the disease or the depression, whatever it might be, gets the best of somebody and they end up passing away. And we're left here wondering how much better the world could have been if they had believed in themselves. If they had a platform, right, to be their full, functional, and flawed self, because we have to make room for both. Nobody in our society is perfect. Nobody in our family is perfect.
That's right.
And we don't criminalize imperfection in our everyday circles the way that we do with people in prison. We criminalize everything. Every thought you have is now criminal because you committed one crime. Mm-hmm. And then people adopt that, and we've lost too many people. Man, I can't even count. I literally can't count. I've lost count how many people in the last 2 years I've lost that I loved genuinely on the inside, men and women. And the worst part about it for me has been how now, man, I went through like 15 losses last year. I couldn't even cry. I couldn't. And then it took one that really broke me, when my friend Gina passed away, because she had all the potential in the world, one of the most beautiful people I've ever known. And I talked to her and watched her struggle over and over again, and tried to tell her, like, you are worthy and valuable and you have so much to give to our world. And then I watched her get beat up by communities and systems to the point that she gave up. And I finally was able to grieve. And it's also the wildest thing in the world to experience that loss and then experience the gratitude that I was finally able to grieve all of these losses collectively with somebody so important to me.
I have a similar, you know what I mean? It's hard, like what my process typically is, it's hard for me to get emotional right away, just because it's happened so many times. We have a board in our office down there. Sign it says "Never Forgotten." It's a black board, and people write on it like people's names. And you know what I mean? It's there, and it's like open. It's open, and people. I didn't ask them to do it, but people that like just writing names on the board, right? And I'm looking at the board, and I'm like, 28, 29 people on the board I was incarcerated with. You know what I mean? And you start thinking about that. It's like if I like broke down in the way I feel sometimes, I couldn't function. You know what I mean? Because it happens so often. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so what happens for me lots of times is that it comes out. Like yesterday morning, I went shopping with my wife, and we're in the parking garage, and I got emotional around somebody that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and it just comes out sometimes, and then once that hits, and then you start thinking about all these other people, and then so I process it that way. I gotta hold on to it for a little bit and like not let it impact me so hard, because like I said, it happens so frequently. And then then for me, like part of it is like I start to try to memorialize people. You know what I mean? Like I named our recovery house after somebody that was close to me. Our residential treatment program after somebody that I felt. You know what I mean? Like I want to memorialize people and really focus on the times that I had with them. You know what I mean? And make it try to focus on the positive. But sometimes it's just so difficult because it weighs so heavy on us. And for me, it drives me to go harder on what's in front of me right now. Like what can we change? And if somebody passes away in vain, right? It's no one ever really, kept them alive, right? Like, so in my process, it's really about like trying to keep the memories of these folks present and keep them alive so that I can keep, and that's like what collectively starts going, okay, it starts to become fuel to create resources and create community, and because this is really what it comes down to, man. Like I've been riding like this because of my friends that and my family that have passed away, not only from the disease, but like the mental health and the solitary confinement and like everything that they've been going through. And it's like, man, like we just need to lend a hand in the right times, you know what I mean? Before it's becomes too late, you know.
We've got a pretty healthy recovery community in the state of Maine, and we've got a pretty healthy community of advocates who are advocating at every level, grassroots all the way up to the legislative level, trying to influence policy and law around some of these issues. And one of my favorite slogans that I've watched really, start and catch like fire in Maine specifically is the idea that, this is the actual slogan, that people who use drugs don't deserve to die. And it's like really to frame it up like that and with death, right? That's what we're talking about. And I can remember last year I was testifying before the legislature on a bill to expand our Good Samaritan law. And the fact that people in power disagreed with decriminalizing calling the police, right, to save a life of somebody who's overdosing was like, I was enraged. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I couldn't. I was listening to people talk about why we shouldn't have a Good Sam law that, completely protects people who call the police to save a life. And I was just dumbfounded. And I remember when I gave my testimony to the legislature, I asked like the impossible question for people with extreme privilege in our society, which is, what if it was your kid? And this is the twilight zone about like this to me. When you ask people, what if it was your kid? And they say it could never be my kid because I've taught my kid better. My kid has love. My kid won't use drugs because they have a future. Like they name all these reasons to you why they can't conceptualize that their kid could be the one overdosing and not having somebody call for help. And then my response is always, you just named a bunch of things that your kid didn't choose. Your kid didn't choose to have a loving family. Your kid didn't choose to have healthy schools. Your kid didn't choose to be part of a good community. Those were all things that were provided to your child. And guess what? There's millions of children who have the opposite thing happening, right? They didn't choose the abuse that they endured. They didn't choose the shitty school that they go to that didn't actually teach them anything. They didn't choose to be surrounded by drugs in their community. These aren't choices that our kids are making. And so it always comes down to me, the ridiculousness and the absurdity of people unwilling to empathize with our community, because it could be your kid and it could be your father and it could be your brother and it could be your best friend who, just like one of our most powerful guests that we've had on, talked about getting injured and overprescribed opiates. That wasn't a choice that Nicole made, right? And so I remember testifying before the legislature and really asking people to like personalize this and asking the Maine legislature to save one life with common sense legislation, because we out here in this community, in these streets doing this work, we've lost hundreds. Save one of my friends, right? And it's like, this is why we have to talk about loss, because we have to talk. You have your life and you have nothing else. While your heart is still beating, you said this in a previous episode, while you're still breathing and your heart is still beating, that means you have a chance. And so we have to talk about what that means to keep people's hearts beating, and even if that means supporting them through struggle and offering them resources that they need to have. If their heart is still beating, they have a chance to be something in this world. And we have to save a life, because we shouldn't be subjected to hundreds and hundreds of loss every year to the point where it becomes normal, to where we can't even get emotional about it. And like one thing that I'm super passionate about, I know that you are as well, and I know that most of the people in our community, if not all of them, are passionate about, is like, where do we get structures and systems in place that save a life, right? And I will forever, and I just ask everybody who's listening to this episode, who's having a hard time really relating to what we're talking about, to really ask yourself, look in the mirror and ask yourself, what if it was my kid? What if it was my dad? What if it was my sister that I watched struggle with these cycles that they didn't choose? What would I want for them in terms of laws and structures and systems? We can't continue to support systems that take life. And that's what our systems do right now. Our systems of incarceration, our systems of, like a lot of our medical systems with the overprescribing, with all of these things, a lot of our legislative systems, a lot of our power structures, they take life. And that's not what they're there for. They're there to save life. And I just think about all the people that just needed one more shot. They needed one more shot and they didn't have that chance, and I'll show up every time and encourage people to think about, what if it was you? What if it was somebody that you love? Like, because I am, you are. Every single person that we know who's been through the system and struggled with addiction is somebody that somebody loves.
Yeah, 100%.
And we got to stop pretending like that's not the reality, And this is such a hard thing to talk about. It's such an impossible thing to talk about, to have an episode on all the loss that we've experienced, and all the things that are taken from people when they went to prison, just to come home and lose their life because of that. It's not, a lot of times it's not a choice that they made. And it's just, I don't think anything could be more important than to talk about loss.
Sure. Because
we're talking about local Maine communities. We're one of the smallest states in the country. And look at the amount of loss that we experience. Take that somewhere else and let's quantify it. Let's quantify the thousands of people that we're losing every year in the United States of America to addiction and to issues directly related to incarceration. And then let's ask if the system is fair. Let's ask if justice is achieved. And that's got to be the conversation that we start to generate. It's got to be scaled up, right? We got to personalize it so that we can then depersonalize it and really have people start to imagine just how big this problem is and how many thousands of lives we could save if we had healthy systems. If we had healthy reentry, if we had healthy treatment, if we had supportive services for people getting out and dealing with addiction to actually maximize their potential and reprogram a story about themselves that takes them away from just being worth nothing to being worth a shot, a chance. I am worthy of a second chance. We don't have that story enough.
Right. I was as you've been talking, my mind's been wandering to this place of like the generational impacts that these issues that you just brought up, like the impacts of incarceration, substance use, mental health, all that stuff, domestic violence, things like that. Like, if somebody gets out right now and say, heaven forbid, they have 2-3 children at home, and heaven forbid that they pass away shortly thereafter of coming home, right? They have 2 or 3 children, right? The essentially, they fatherless, right? And what are the impacts on those children of being fatherless? We know what that looks like, right? We know what it's like to have an absent parent from the home. And how many times is that happening across our country every day or every year where, if I pass away, how many people are affected by it? How many children are without a father or a mother because of, passing away prematurely? But and then you think, and how long has this actually been going on? Because this isn't a new thing for me. You know what I mean? Like, as long as I can remember, the people, like we are dying at a pretty large rate, right? So how many people are affected by that as a whole?
Yeah.
Like you said, we're the smallest state, you know what I mean? Like we're a pretty small state, but nationally, I talk about this a lot too, is like, there's over 2 million people in prison, and how many of those people have children?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Talking about millions of kids
Directly affected.
And then when it's like, okay, mom or dad's coming home, and then something happens, right? I was watching the documentary Jacinta, and it gave a pretty good depiction of some things, but I just want to point to something, right? That when she had gotten out, it showed her, she got out incarceration. She started doing treatment. She went to a recovery house, and then she goes up and sees her child for the first time, right? They go have a great day. This, you know what I mean? It was like really nice to watch them have a nice day together in the documentary, right? And then immediately leaving the house, she goes and she got high, right? Mm-hmm. Immediately leaving this nice visit with her child, she got high, right? And how many times does the shame of being away from your child drive people to use substances? And how many times does that shame from being away from your child cause you to use substances that you get poisoned from, right? Yeah. And lose your life, right? So like when you think about that, how many times that has played out and like there's no preparation for that, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think watching that documentary that I don't think Jacinta saw it coming really either.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you know, in my recovery, I can remember a relapse, right? And it'd be almost like you're having an out-of-body experience watching yourself do these things, right?
Yeah.
I think I was like watching her day. It was probably the same thing. She probably in the fight inside me. I don't want to do this.
But I also don't want to confront that even though this was a beautiful day, I missed this for how many days?
Right, like and then you talk about how many times is that scenario played out across the country all the time, right? When people are getting out, it's like she wasn't prepared.
Yeah.
And how that in that moment. And it's like if it's played out that many times across our country, shouldn't there be an education or reunification process that's not so sudden for the person?
It's so damaging and like forces you to confront a million negative emotions about yourself and your situation all at the same time. And it's so timely that you told that story, because when we're talking about loss, and we're talking about the loss of like human life and all the people we've seen pass away, but what a symptom of that is the loss that you just described. Because how many men and women have I talked to that were away? And it doesn't matter if you were away for a year or 20 years. Think about how much changes in your child's life in a year, right? And we think about the loss that a parent experiences when they become incarcerated. And again, I'm just going to come back to this idea that society normalizes this as punishment. That like, oh, well, you did something wrong, so you have to be punished. But when we start breaking down what the punishment is, we start really thinking about how inhumane it is to take somebody from their family and then raise a million barriers in staying connected with your family, with your loved one, with your spouse, with your children, with your parents. And I can't even, as somebody, I have a child coming in January, right? I'm going to be a father. And it's the pride of, like, I've never felt so moved and inspired and excited about something in my life. And I think about even the fact that my daughter is not here yet. The idea of being stripped from her life is something that I can't even wrap my mind around it. And so I can't even imagine what it's like as a parent, like, especially with everything that we're talking about is true. Like, you didn't choose everything that you've done in your life. You were exposed to trauma and harm and all these things that have made it really hard to function as what, people call a normal member of society, as if everybody's experience in society is the same. And I think about how harmful it would be, even for somebody who doesn't use drugs, right? Even for somebody who's never experienced like that side of the evil, as somebody who has their, quote unquote, head on their shoulders and is like really going places and all these other ridiculous things we say to categorize people, to come home after 3 years and confront the fact that your son was 3 when you went in and now he's 6, and everything that you missed from 3 to 6. How do you... Man, I just got to give a big shout out to everybody who's ever done that and been able to say, okay, like, I missed it and now I'm here, because I can't even imagine the strength that it takes to not resort back to the destructive things that those coping mechanisms that people had. And so my question is, like, I just said way too many words to get to this question. Why do we accept the system that not only takes you from your kids, but then makes it impossible for you to parent while you're in the system? That the only connection you have with your kids is 1 or 2 hours a week, maybe 3 or 4 hours a week on opposite sides of a wooden table where somebody in a police uniform is watching every move that you make and making it almost impossible for you to have a genuine connection with your kids and your loved ones. And then we expect people to come out and figure out how to parent after 3 years, 1 year, 30 years of not parenting. That's got to be the hardest shit in the world, man.
Well, it is, and I think that it's you know, we got to shine a light on the issue, right? Like this is this type of thing that if we don't shine a light on that and say like maybe this is how we can prevent loss, and I think maybe how do these two things connect to like people passing away of substance use or whatever it is. I know many men and women that die by suicide. You know what I mean? Like all this stuff, and the reason I bring this up is because of the shame.
Yeah.
Right? That's what's killing people.
Yeah.
Right? The shame is killing people. It's not necessarily a drug, right?
Yeah.
That drug is on the table. That drug is neither here nor there. It's neither good nor bad. It's a thing. You know what I'm saying? What drives us to pick that up after I haven't used drugs in several years because I was incarcerated?
It's a shame.
It's not because I'm physically addicted to that drug. It's because I don't have any other choice to make this shit go away but to change how I'm feeling.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I don't feel a way out of it. I'm stuck, like you just was talking about your friend, Jay. She's stuck. I every time I turn around, I feel like the door's being closed in my face. And how long do you think? And let me ask you, how long do you think this cycle that we're talking about right now has played out over the years in American history?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like my emotional brain just wants to acknowledge that it's played out forever, right? Since our very first prisoner, arrived at prison. But my intellectual brain also understands that if we track back the last 40 years, we've seen the evolution of mass incarceration in our country.
Right.
And it's a problem that, we have a system of incarceration in this country that criminalizes blackness, right? That criminalizes that others people, right? If you're a person of color, you're way disproportionately more likely to experience, incarceration. And we've never, talked enough about doing the math that you're talking about, which is we've watched the war on drugs lock up millions of people and completely ignored exactly what you just said, that even though society knows that our system is not functional, by and large, people acknowledge that, but we don't acknowledge the fact that dysfunctional system is killing people with shame. Right? It's killing you because of the shame that it instills. And so punishment has never worked historically, right? It's never been an effective way to treat any of the social issues that we try to treat it with. But then we created a system where not only did we normalize punishment, but we punish people for things that had nothing to do with them, right? We made laws that criminalize things that shouldn't be crimes. And so now when we're talking about like really addressing this on a scale, we've gone from hundreds to thousands to millions of people who are experiencing exactly what you just described, and it's broken. It's wrong.
Well, then really, what happens, right, is it's the deconstruction of the American family, right?
Yeah.
Because there's an absent parent at home for millions
of children.
And millions
of children.
Go back decades, right? We can go back decades. We can go back, like you said, to when prisons were started and all that stuff, and then we can correlate everything to this war on drugs that you were talking about, decades and decades.
Yeah.
Like we go back to the mid '80s, and then all of a sudden, I don't think our country was it wasn't as impactful then as it is now, because now we have generations, right?
Yeah.
We have generations of loss.
Yeah.
We have generations of kids that don't know how to cope with what's going on around them, and then they're bringing children into the world, right? So if I heaven forbid, if I passed away tomorrow, right? Who's gonna take care of my kid? Like, who's gonna show my kids how to do these things? And hopefully, the precious amount of time that I've spent with them
will have influenced them.
I have influenced them. But if I'm in prison for 10 years, I have no influence. You know what I mean?
And then
I have no influence.
imagine the grief of a child who has lived with that during that time where their parent is locked up, and they've just been told by society and the judge and everybody around them that your dad was a piece of shit. That's why he went to prison. And imagine how they internalize that.
Yeah.
Right. And imagine the struggle that comes with that. And it's wild, man. When I was just hearing you talk a second ago, I literally had this thought about, like, we're talking about, the big picture hope is that we abolish all of these really like divisive and destructive systems that we have that are doing these things that we're talking about. But even for people who aren't ready to envision abolishing prison and abolishing the criminalization of addiction and all of these things, I just want to ask people, like, what would it look like if our system was not built on total loss? What would it look like if, even though the prison exists and somebody does something and gets 10 years in prison, instead of putting them in prison and just telling their family and their friends, figure it out, you'll be okay? What if we actually offered services to victims? What if we actually offered services to families of people who are incarcerated who, newsflash, are victims, right? When you lose the breadwinner in your family, when you lose the caretaker in your family, regardless of what they've done, you still are experiencing loss, and you're not a criminal.
When you think about, and the single mom that's raising several children, working 2 or 3 jobs, right? So now, I'm just using this as an example, right? Dad's in prison, and mom's working 2 jobs to keep the lights on, right? And the kids are now, you know what I mean? Like, they experience another form of loss because mom's working that she has to take. And this is just obviously, like I said, an example, and it's not always the way it goes. But I feel like that's a more, it's a stronger possibility of that happening than anything else. Like that. Yeah, I just want to. I guess and part of this is like I want to show some respect to these single moms out 100%. Here trying to take care of a home and the children and everything, and also in some cases trying to support the person that's incarcerated. You know what I mean? And so when you talk about loss, the finality of death, and then the somebody being away from home for an extended period of temporary time and trying to figure that out, and like the impacts of all these things combined really puts our communities at a disadvantage in so many different ways, right?
Yeah. And why don't people recognize that, right? Like, why don't people recognize that disadvantage? And so, first of all, I just want to echo what you just said. Shout out to our single moms. Shout out to our single dads. Shout out to our grandparents who are picking up the pieces.
Grandparents are raising so many kids.
Yeah, shout out to all of you who are picking up the pieces that are left behind because of our system of mass incarceration. But also, let us acknowledge what society does to you, because society criminalizes that single mom, right? Society says, well, you should have known better. You should have chose him. And society criminalizes those grandparents and says, well, that's what you get when your son or daughter commits a crime, right? And that's the loss that we don't talk about enough. And I'm so happy that this conversation is going to that place. Let's stop criminalizing people who don't commit crimes. Can we start there? Is that a more tolerable conversation for people to have? Like, instead of criminalizing the single mom whose husband goes to prison and now she's on her own, and we just say, well, that's what you get for choosing him. No, let's not criminalize those people. Can we start with that and then eventually work our way towards understanding that crime is not a linear thing. It's not a moral binary. It's not just good and bad. But, like, shout out to you, single mother, who's picking up the pieces and facing the stigma in society about who you are because somebody that you love made a mistake. And let's stop criminalizing the children of those parents who didn't choose what mommy or daddy did. Right? Let's stop criminalizing people and then we talk about shame. Let's stop shaming people who didn't do something wrong, right? It's not that 6-year-old child's fault that daddy had to go to prison because he had a drug addiction that he couldn't figure out how to shake because he never had the services that he needed to get sober or get clean or get functional. Let's stop making that child feel like there's something inherently wrong with them because of what happened. And that comes down to the part that you're talking about too, that's generational. Right? Because we've normalized this behavior in society, because we've criminalized the actual person who committed the crime and their spouse and their parents and their children, now we've created a generational trauma that is really shameful if we really think about it. So how do we do, this is a huge question. We're not going to answer it in this podcast. We're not going to answer it in this decade. How do we stop criminalizing people, especially those who didn't commit crimes? It's insanity.
I think there's so many ways that we can do a better job of addressing these issues that we're talking about and decreasing loss. Because like I said in the beginning, like a lot of the loss that I've seen out here has been completely avoidable.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And like it didn't have to get to this point, but for whatever reason it does. And I think that, coming back to some of the other stuff that we talked about around legislature advocating and advocating for trauma-informed solutions rather than just continuing to punish people. You know what I mean? Because that's like it's not about the person, right? There's like there's all these other dynamics, and so we could. If we spent our money right, we could definitely address some of these things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think there's ways to spend our money so that like people that really want, that are into crime, punishment, and stuff like that, they can be satisfied and we can return people back into the community that don't feel like their life is over. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and another part of it too is, like exactly what we're doing here, and it's why I feel honored to be on this podcast with you. Right? We need to start convincing each other. Like you don't have to be ashamed, and if you are ashamed, that's okay too. But you don't have to hide your shame. You can talk about it, right? Like let's force people to confront the humanity of people in prisons and jails. Let's force people to confront the humanity of people struggling with addiction and substance use, because once you can actually talk about it and once you can name it, and you don't feel so stigmatized and you don't feel so shamed about the things that have gone wrong in your life, then you can start to heal from it. And isn't that what treatment is all about? Getting people to understand what they've been through and understand that, like, you still deserve to live. You still deserve to thrive. You still deserve to be a father and a mother and a son and a daughter and a community member. And I just hope that for anybody that's listening today, that they really start to believe, if you're questioning for 1 second, if your story matters, if your life matters, trust me, it does. Because until we tell your story and until we really talk about what you've been through in your life, then we're going to continue to allow people to keep us in the shadows and hide from the realities that we face collectively.
Well, this the shame and stuff. Like I can tell you, this is I am still to this day dealing, and it's something that I have to be disciplined about to like tell myself that like this isn't like. You're deserving of your life right now. You know what I'm saying? Like it's still something that I'm still working through. You know what I mean? Through therapy and a lot of other means, right? But like, if we do not like, if people just, we guys got to be valued. We got to feel valued. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of different ways that if we continue to have these conversations and the right people start hearing it and like we start advocating for the right things. We can make a difference if we keep talking about it, right? Like, cause my friends, my friends that aren't with us anymore, they're here in this very moment because we're talking about it, right? That we're talking about we can still, people don't have to die in vain. Our community does not have to take a loss in vain if we're willing to learn lessons from it and like learn from the stories that have happened. And our society's not going to learn from them if they're not being told, right?
Yeah, one thing I know for sure, man, is, I know for a fact that if the time ever comes, because I've seen it happen in real life when people with power experience what we're talking about and then all of a sudden start to care about it, right? But I don't want to wait for governors to experience a child incarcerated. I don't want to wait for senators to experience the loss of somebody who overdosed. I don't want to wait for a president who finally comes into office who knows about addiction firsthand and knows about incarceration firsthand before our laws start changing and our systems start improving. I don't want to wait for that. So I just want to encourage people out there to, tell your story and confront whatever shame that you experience head on by saying very loud and clear, like, yeah, I might have made some mistakes in my life, but I know that I'm worthy of life, right? And let's continue to lift each other up in community and convince each other of that, and just hope and pray that we start to experience a little less loss. Let's tell the children that we know with incarcerated parents that that's not their fault. And let's also tell them that, mommy or daddy, has some work that they need to do, but they're still mommy and daddy and they still love you and they have the potential to be good people. Let's start convincing each other that the shame that we have, we can heal from. And then let's start convincing others that if they continue to shame people, then they're going to continue the cycles of, insanity that we're talking about today. And, I think we're going to have some future episodes because this is such a big topic. We have to continue to unpack it. We have to memorialize and celebrate some of our brothers and sisters who have lost, who went too soon, and really tell their stories in the world so that people really understand what they're missing because these people are gone. And we're going to continue to do that. But I just hope that everybody who's listening, man, I hope one thing you take away from this is that, like the slogan in the main recovery community says, people who use drugs don't deserve to die, and people who go to prison don't deserve to die. And the minute that we stop thinking that punishment and shame and stigma is somehow corrective is the minute we give people a chance to live and contribute and thrive and be the best parents and be everything that they want to be, but that the shame keeps them from being. And it's almost sad to have to end this episode because I feel like we could talk all night about this.
Yeah, we could, but I think you're right. And I think there's a lot of different conversations that we can. This is a pretty deep topic, and I think you can only talk about it for a short amount of time, and it's only going to scratch the surface. So I think it's really important that we continue this type of conversation because when we can turn these losses into gain, that's when the real impact is going to happen in our community.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, if you're listening and you're somebody who's experienced substance use and you've experienced addiction, if you're listening and you're somebody who's ever been to jail or been to prison, somebody might not have told you this in a while, man, but we see you, we love you, we relate to you, and we want you to understand that today is just the start and that you can have a huge impact in this world and you don't have to hide from anybody anymore. And that's what Behind the Door is out here to say. So, thank you for everybody who's listening. Thank you for everybody who's hitting that subscribe button. Hit that subscribe button. You heard it from Jeremy at the beginning. Support. And just spread the message. Tell somebody about this episode. Tell somebody about other episodes that have, stuck out for you. And, just thank you to everybody supporting us. We'll say it a million more times, hopefully. And this has been another episode of Behind the Door.